It was a Friday evening, and the Thompson family sat down at their usual table in one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Ethan, their only child, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the smooth surface of the menu. The elegant surroundings, with their dimmed lights and hushed conversations, felt like an extension of his own life, predictable, flawless, and safe. He glanced at his phone, then let out a low laugh, sending a sideways glance at his parents. He wasn't laughing at anything in particular, it was just the kind of casual, confident chuckle that people who've always been comfortable use when nothing truly matters. But something was different this evening. As the laughter slipped from his lips, he couldn't help but feel a strange, almost reckless impulse rising within him. It was like a push, deep inside, urging him to do something out of character. "You know what would be fun?" he asked, his voice casual as he typed something quickly on his phone. "I met this girl at the park earlier. She's homeless. Wouldn't it be hilarious if I invited her here to meet you both?" Ethan's parents, who were engrossed in their usual high society chatter about business deals and investments, paused for a moment at his words. His father, Charles, a stoic man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and a well-tailored suit, lifted an eyebrow, glancing at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. His mother, Caroline, a striking woman in her early 50s with a commanding presence, didn't even blink. She simply smiled, her lips tight as she adjusted her diamond necklace, an unconscious move that made her appear more poised than ever. Ethan grinned, thinking it was a joke, a mere distraction from the usual dinner banter. He never expected it to go any further. But then, something strange happened. His mother's smile faltered ever so slightly. Just for a second, her eyes darted to the window, then back to him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she quickly masked it with a soft chuckle. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice dripping with the sweetness she used when she thought her son needed calming. "That's an interesting thought. But do you think she would feel comfortable in a place like this?" Ethan didn't think much of her reaction. He was used to his mother's carefully curated politeness. He had no idea that this brief exchange would set off a chain of events none of them could ever foresee. He had been joking, of course. The girl he'd met at the park was, as he had noticed, a homeless young woman in her 20s, sitting alone on a bench with a paper cup in front of her. Ethan had thought nothing more of it than a passing curiosity at the time. But for some reason, as he scrolled through his phone that evening, he couldn't shake the image of her. Something in her eyes had caught his attention, something that made her stand out amidst the other transient souls he usually saw begging for scraps. She didn't seem desperate, not in the way most of them did. She didn't ask for help or pity, she simply existed in that space between people who had nothing and those who had everything, like a ghost that could be easily overlooked. But Ethan didn't overlook her. Instead, he took a selfie in front of the park, texting it to his friends with a sly comment. The text was playful, an inside joke between him and his circle. But then, out of nowhere, he thought, what if I really invited her? His finger hovered over his phone's screen, and before he could second-guess himself, he tapped the message and sent it. "Hey, what are you doing tonight? Want to come to dinner with me and my parents? We're at that fancy place on Fifth Avenue." It was impulsive, spontaneous, almost reckless. He wasn't used to reaching out to people he didn't know, especially people from a completely different world. But there was something in her that made him curious, something that wasn't in the polished and perfectly posed faces of the other women he usually surrounded himself with. Something real. For a moment, there was no response. He didn't think there would be. But to his surprise, a message pinged on his screen just moments later. "Sure. I'll be there." It was as simple as that. He felt a thrill rush through him. Of course, he didn't expect her to actually show up. It was a joke, wasn't it? The kind of thing that would make for a great laugh later. Maybe she'd turn up, and maybe she wouldn't. But either way, the idea felt almost intoxicating, the thought of doing something entirely unexpected, of breaking free from the staleness of his everyday life. But as the minutes ticked by and the evening wore on, Ethan began to wonder if perhaps he had overestimated his own sense of adventure. What if she really did come? What if things became uncomfortable? He imagined his mother's judgmental stare, his father's passive-aggressive remarks about social status. They weren't bad people, not exactly. But they had always been very careful about the circles they moved in, and Ethan had been trained to follow their example. His parents expected him to behave like they did, restrained, polite, above reproach. And yet, here he was, on the verge of inviting a homeless girl to dinner with them. The implications of that were not lost on him. As he stared into the dimly lit restaurant, a slight unease began to settle over him. Minutes before the reservation time, as he glanced nervously around the elegant restaurant, a black-suited maitre d' ushered the Thompsons to their usual booth. The chandelier overhead gleamed like an expensive piece of jewelry, casting soft, ambient light on the polished wooden floors. It was all perfectly curated, and the moment they sat down, the feeling of exclusivity wrapped around them like a velvet blanket. The menu was full of rich delicacies, everything priced at an eye-watering level. The ambience was precisely what it was meant to be, a sanctuary for the rich, the powerful, and those who had the world at their fingertips. And then, the door to the restaurant opened, and Ethan saw her. Isabel. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, unsure of herself. She was dressed in a faded green hoodie and worn jeans, the kind of clothes you find in thrift stores or on the backs of those who have nowhere else to turn. She stood awkwardly, scanning the room, her eyes finally landing on Ethan, who suddenly felt his stomach tighten with dread. This was real. She had actually come. For a moment, he was frozen. He had been ready to laugh at the absurdity of his own invitation, but now it felt different. As she stepped forward, the other diners at the tables nearby shifted their gaze. Their eyes widened, some of them casting judgmental looks, others whispering behind their hands. The contrast between her and the patrons of the restaurant was stark. Ethan glanced at his parents, their faces now clouded with disbelief. Caroline Thompson, Ethan's mother, froze in her seat, her mouth a thin line. She barely managed to smile, her usual poise slipping for the first time in years. Her eyes flickered nervously as she looked at her son, then back at Isabel. She forced herself to stand, but the awkwardness in her movements was undeniable. "Well, well," she said softly, a slight tremor in her voice. "It's nice to meet you." But Ethan could see it. The discomfort, the confusion. His mother had always been careful with the image she projected to the world, and she didn't know how to navigate this situation. This wasn't something she could control. And the more she looked at Isabel, the more she realized just how out of place she truly was in that world. The scene at the restaurant suddenly felt like it was spinning out of control. What was meant to be a light-hearted joke, a moment of harmless fun, was now a situation that none of them knew how to handle. And as Isabel walked toward their table, every step she took seemed to echo louder in Ethan's mind. This was the moment that would change everything, for all of them. Isabel's steps echoed in the high-ceilinged restaurant, each footfall growing louder in Ethan's ears as he watched her approach. His heart raced, the adrenaline of his impulsive decision now dawning on him in full force. This wasn't some harmless joke anymore. This was real. The unease in his chest tightened as he looked at his mother, whose face had shifted from surprise to a thin, tight-lipped smile, the kind of smile that was all too familiar, the one that said, "We need to make this situation go away, quickly." Caroline's eyes flickered toward the other tables, noticing the glances that followed Isabel. Whispers started to ripple through the room, some of them audible, and others just felt, the weight of judgment hanging in the air. Ethan couldn't quite look at his mother. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had thought he was merely making a statement, showing off to his friends, acting on a whim, but now, standing in front of him, Isabel was no longer a punchline. She was a person, someone he had invited into this perfect world, and it was clear that the world wasn't prepared to accept her. Isabel, right? Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He had never felt more out of place in his own skin than he did in that moment. He had hoped this would be a funny story to tell his friends, something wild and unpredictable. But now it felt like a mistake, an embarrassing misstep that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Isabel nodded shyly, her eyes scanning the room. Her expression was a mixture of nerves and curiosity, like someone who was used to being ignored but was trying, against all odds, to fit into a place that she had no business being in. She took a deep breath, and the tension in the room seemed to shift. She wasn't just standing there like an outsider anymore, she was a part of something that felt both impossible and inevitable. "Please, sit," Ethan managed, his voice barely steady. He motioned to the empty seat at the table, but as Isabel moved toward it, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. A couple seated nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, and a few others turned their heads, eyes narrowing as they whispered among themselves. Isabel hesitated for a moment, a look of uncertainty flashing across her face. She wasn't used to these kinds of spaces, spaces where everything was polished, where the chairs and tables gleamed with pristine cleanliness, where every surface reflected an image of success and perfection. She had spent too many nights sleeping on benches or in shelters to feel like she belonged here. The stares, the whispered conversations, all of it felt suffocating, like an invisible wall that only she could see. But then, she took a step forward, quietly sitting at the table as if she belonged. She glanced at Ethan briefly, a small, shy smile tugging at her lips as though to reassure him that everything would be okay. But he wasn't sure it would be. Not anymore. Caroline cleared her throat, the sound sharp and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. She put down her wine glass, eyes never leaving Isabel. "It's a bit unexpected, don't you think?" she said, her voice a strange mix of polite curiosity and discomfort. "This isn't exactly the kind of place someone in your position would usually come to, is it?" Ethan's blood ran cold at her words. The way his mother had phrased it made it clear that she saw Isabel as a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, a piece that didn't belong. The casual dismissal in her voice was so subtle, but it was unmistakable. It was the kind of thing that made Ethan feel like he had made a grave error, inviting someone from such a different world into this carefully curated life. Isabel's gaze faltered at Caroline's words, but she didn't back down. "I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the awkwardness surrounding her. "I just thought it would be nice to see what it's like." Ethan wanted to say something, to apologize for the way the situation had escalated, but the words stuck in his throat. His mother's disapproval hung thick in the air, and his father, Charles, was silent, watching the exchange with a tight-lipped expression. Ethan had always known that his parents were meticulous in their social interactions, that they made sure to surround themselves with the right kind of people, the ones who would elevate their status and reputation. But seeing them now, reacting to Isabel as though she were a stain on their evening, made him feel sick to his stomach. "I think we should order," Ethan said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But the discomfort was palpable. It was clear that no one knew how to move forward, how to treat Isabel, who had come into their world uninvited, as if breaking some unspoken rule. The waiter came by to take their order, and for a moment, the focus shifted away from Isabel. But the tension didn't subside. Caroline and Charles exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. It was the kind of look that said, "How do we make this go away?" Caroline's gaze flickered toward Isabel again, and then back to Ethan, as though she was trying to gauge whether this was just a phase or if he was truly serious about this strange, unplanned dinner. Isabel's silence stretched on, her gaze downward, not daring to look anyone in the eye. Ethan could tell she was trying her best to fit in, but every movement seemed to highlight how out of place she was. She wasn't part of this world, and everyone knew it. As the dinner progressed, the conversation was strained. Caroline and Charles made polite conversation with Isabel, their words carefully chosen, but the awkwardness in the air was thick. Ethan kept glancing between them and Isabel, noticing how his mother's smile became more forced, how his father's replies became curt. It was as though they were just going through the motions, trying to make this strange situation go away without causing a scene. But Isabel didn't seem to mind. She took the questions in stride, her responses calm and composed. She talked about the things she had seen, the people she had met, the places she had been, and there was a quiet strength in her voice that caught Ethan off guard. It was different from anything he had expected. He had thought she would be awkward, or shy, or perhaps out of place in a way that would be uncomfortable for everyone. But Isabel wasn't like that. She wasn't trying to apologize for her life, for the decisions she had made, for the fact that she didn't have the things they had. She wasn't trying to fit into their world. She was simply existing in it, unapologetically, and that was both unsettling and captivating to Ethan. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself increasingly distracted by the contrast between Isabel's calm demeanor and his parents' stiff, uncomfortable smiles. The more he watched, the more he realized just how deeply their world was built on appearances. It wasn't about substance, it was about status. And as long as everyone played their part, no one had to question anything. But Isabel, sitting across from him, didn't seem to care about that. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to be something she wasn't. And that, more than anything, was what made her so different from the people he had always known. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she simply didn't have to prove anything. Ethan's mind raced. How had he let this get so far? He had wanted to be the one to shock his friends, to do something unexpected. But now, as he sat at the table, watching his parents squirm under the weight of their own discomfort, he realized that he was the one who had underestimated everything. What had started as a joke, a playful, mischievous way to show off, had turned into something that neither he nor his parents were prepared for. And the more he tried to pretend it was just another dinner, the more he realized how deeply this moment would affect all of them. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of strained conversation and forced pleasantries. Ethan didn't know what to say, and no one else seemed willing to break the silence. When the check came, he hesitated before paying, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He had invited Isabel to this dinner for reasons he couldn't fully explain, but now, as he watched his parents' discomfort, he began to understand something he hadn't before. This wasn't just a matter of social status, this was about the world they lived in, a world that Isabel didn't belong to. A world that he had always taken for granted, until now. And as they left the restaurant, the weight of the evening hung over him like a shadow, threatening to follow him long after the night was over. Ethan knew one thing for sure, things were never going to be the same again. The days that followed were like a slow burn for Ethan. The awkward dinner with Isabel had been a catalyst, but he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that he had made a colossal mistake. The tension from that night didn't dissipate like he had hoped. Instead, it lingered in the background, quietly festering as he moved through the motions of his privileged life. His friends didn't let him forget about it. They teased him relentlessly, joking about how the homeless girl had rubbed elbows with his rich parents, but there was a bite behind their words. They didn't understand why he had done it, and neither did he, at least not fully. Isabel had become this strange enigma in his life. He couldn't get her out of his head. He had thought inviting her to dinner would be a wild story to share with his social circle, but now, it seemed like he had opened a door to a side of the world that he wasn't prepared for. She wasn't just some homeless girl anymore. She was a reminder of the disconnect between his world and the world outside. A reminder of the things he had always taken for granted. The way his parents had reacted to Isabel was also eating away at him. They had been so uncomfortable, so quick to dismiss her presence, as though she didn't belong in the same room as them. Their judgment, cloaked in politeness, was something Ethan could no longer ignore. It wasn't that they had treated her poorly, it was the unspoken message in their every glance and word. They had made her feel like an outsider, someone who didn't fit the mold of their perfect little world. Ethan's guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about Isabel and how she had quietly accepted their treatment without ever trying to make them feel guilty or uncomfortable. She had shown a strength that he hadn't anticipated, a quiet dignity that made him question his own actions. The way she had sat there, talking to them as though she belonged, as though their judgments didn't affect her. And for a moment, he wondered how she had gotten so strong, how she had learned to navigate a world that so clearly rejected her. Isabel hadn't been the one who needed to change, Ethan realized. It was him. It was his world. And maybe, just maybe, the truth was that his life had been far too sheltered to see things as they really were. But things weren't so simple. He couldn't change everything overnight. Ethan had always been the golden child, the one who was expected to succeed, to follow the rules, to make the right decisions. But what was the right decision now? He found himself wrestling with this question as he walked through his days, feeling trapped in the bubble that had once seemed so comfortable. Every time he bumped into his friends, every time someone brought up that dinner, it felt like the weight of it all was closing in on him. He wanted to explain, to tell them that it wasn't just some joke, but he didn't know how to articulate it. He didn't know how to explain the feeling of seeing Isabel in that restaurant, how her quiet strength had unsettled him in ways he couldn't yet understand. And then there was his mother, Caroline. She hadn't spoken to him about the dinner since that night, but Ethan could feel her disappointment in every word, in every look she gave him. She was always so careful, always so meticulous in her judgments. But this time, he could sense something different in her. Something that wasn't just about social propriety. She had grown up with a certain set of expectations, and in her world, there was no room for mistakes, no room for challenges to the status quo. She had built her life around the idea that wealth, status, and appearance were what mattered. But that night, Isabel had shaken that illusion in ways Ethan wasn't ready to admit. The awkwardness had been there, but it had also been a reflection of something much deeper, a clash of worlds that he had never truly understood until now. Ethan's mind kept going back to Isabel. He realized that he hadn't even bothered to check on her after the dinner. He had been so caught up in his own discomfort, in the judgment of his parents and friends, that he hadn't thought to wonder about what Isabel had gone through after walking out of that restaurant. She had sat there, shoulders straight, facing a world that wasn't built for her. She hadn't flinched when they had all stared. She had simply existed, and that had been more than enough. It was strange how quickly things had changed. Just a few days ago, Isabel had been this almost mythical figure in his life, someone he had been fascinated by, someone who seemed to exist on the periphery of his world, someone he could show off to his friends. But now, after that night, she had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with his world. It wasn't just about the dinner, it was about the way they had treated her. And he had been a part of that. He had sat there, pretending like it wasn't a big deal, pretending like this was just some quirky encounter, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. One afternoon, as Ethan walked through the city, he passed by a local park where he thought he saw a familiar face sitting on a bench. Isabel. She was alone, like she had been when they first met. Something about the image made his chest tighten. He had been meaning to go back to her, to find out if she was okay, but he hadn't known how to start the conversation. But now, seeing her in the park, a place far removed from the world he knew, Ethan knew that it was time. Time to face what he had done and, more importantly, time to face who he had become. He approached her cautiously, unsure of what to say. Isabel looked up from the book she was reading, her expression unchanged. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice unsure, "how are you?" She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I'm good. Just reading." Ethan sat down next to her, not knowing where to begin. He hadn't prepared for this moment. But something inside him told him it was important. "I've been thinking about the dinner," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "And I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, or put you in that situation." Isabel closed her book, giving him her full attention. She didn't interrupt him, just waited for him to finish. When he did, she gave a small nod. "It's okay," she said softly. "You didn't know." "I didn't know, but I should have. I should have thought more about how you would feel, about how everyone else would treat you. You didn't deserve that." Isabel tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "I've been in situations like that before," she said, her voice steady. "People stare. People judge. But I don't let it bother me. It's just how the world works, right?" Ethan felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of how far removed he had been from the realities of life. "I don't know how I could have been so blind to it. I've always been so focused on my own world that I didn't even see the way people like you are treated. I'm sorry." Isabel looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since they had met. "It's not just your fault," she said. "It's how people are. They don't understand. But that's not on you. You're learning, and that's all that matters." Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of his guilt still heavy in his chest, but also a sense of relief. This wasn't just about apologizing to her. It was about acknowledging something bigger, his own privilege, his own ignorance, and the walls that had kept him from seeing the truth. "I don't know if I can change everything," he said, looking at her earnestly. "But I want to try. I want to learn from this." Isabel smiled again, this time with a warmth that made Ethan feel like he had taken the first step toward understanding. "You already have," she said quietly. As they sat there, talking about everything and nothing, Ethan realized that this was the turning point. The moment where he could choose to walk away from the world that had always been comfortable but ultimately shallow, or choose to see things differently, to face the uncomfortable truths and grow. Isabel had already done the hard part, she had shown him the truth. Now it was up to him to figure out how to live in it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. Each day felt like a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety, a clash of his old life with the new perspectives he was beginning to embrace. Isabel had awakened something in him, something raw and unsettling, yet incredibly powerful. Her strength, her ability to navigate a world that had given her nothing but hardship, was something Ethan couldn't ignore anymore. He had never truly understood what it meant to struggle, to fight just for the chance to exist with dignity. But Isabel, she had shown him that with grace and resilience, it was possible to maintain that dignity no matter the circumstances. Ethan started making changes, subtle at first, but the ripple effect of those small decisions soon became noticeable. He stopped hanging out with his friends as often, feeling more and more disconnected from their shallow conversations and empty pursuits. It wasn't that he hated them, but their lack of depth, their ignorance, became too much for him to ignore. They had never been bad people, but they had lived in a bubble that shielded them from the harsh realities of the world. Ethan had been in that bubble his whole life, and now he could see it for what it was, a prison of comfort that kept them from understanding the struggles of people like Isabel. He found himself spending more time at the local shelters and community centers, talking to people who had stories to share. He listened to their pain, their resilience, their hopes, and their dreams. It was uncomfortable at first, being around people whose lives were so different from his, but with each conversation, he began to see the world through their eyes. The privilege he had taken for granted, the things he had always believed were just normal, were suddenly put into stark contrast with the challenges that others faced daily. One day, while volunteering at a local soup kitchen, Ethan encountered someone who would change the course of his journey even further. His name was Jack, a middle-aged man with a rough exterior and a history that was written in the lines of his face. Jack had lived on the streets for nearly 2 decades, having fallen victim to addiction and losing everything in the process. But there was something about him that intrigued Ethan. Despite everything he had gone through, Jack still had a fire in his eyes, a sense of hope, however small, that he could rebuild his life. They struck up a conversation, and Ethan found himself asking questions he never would have before. What had it been like, losing everything? How did someone survive on the streets day after day? What was it that kept them going? Jack's answers were raw and real. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told Ethan about the nights he spent freezing in alleys, about the desperation that had driven him to make choices he regretted, and about the moment when he realized that he had to either give up or fight for a chance to start over. "You don't get handed anything in this world," Jack said, his voice rough but filled with conviction. "You have to take it. You have to be willing to fight, even when you feel like the whole world is against you. And most people don't have the stomach for that fight. They look at us like we're broken, like we're worthless, but we're not. We're survivors." Those words stuck with Ethan long after he left the soup kitchen that day. He couldn't shake the image of Jack's weathered face, the fire that burned in his eyes despite everything he had been through. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about finding meaning, purpose, and hope in a world that seemed to take everything from you. Ethan had always thought of success as something defined by money, status, and achievement. But now, he was beginning to understand that true success wasn't about how much you had, it was about how you faced the struggles, how you fought through adversity, and how you held on to your humanity in the face of it all. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan continued to push deeper into this new world. He started speaking to Isabel more regularly, sometimes meeting her in the park, other times at a local cafe. They shared stories, laughed, and even cried together. It was strange at first, connecting with someone who had lived such a different life, but over time, it felt less strange and more natural. Isabel had become a mirror for Ethan, reflecting the parts of him he had never truly understood, his privilege, his apathy, his inability to see beyond his own world. She had helped him open his eyes, but it was up to him to keep them open and to take action. One afternoon, as they sat in the cafe, Isabel surprised Ethan with a question. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you spending so much time helping people like me, people you don't even know?" Ethan had never really thought about it in those terms. He hadn't been helping people just for the sake of it, or for some noble cause. He had been helping because, deep down, he knew that he had to make things right. He had to do something to make up for the years he had spent ignoring the world around him. "I guess," he started, trying to find the right words, "I guess I'm trying to make sense of everything. I've realized that I've been living in this bubble, this world where everything is easy, and I never had to really see what other people go through. I thought I understood what life was about, but I didn't. I still don't, but I'm trying. I'm trying to understand." Isabel smiled, a soft and knowing smile. "You're doing more than understanding," she said. "You're changing. And that's more important than anything else." Those words hit Ethan harder than anything she had said before. He was changing. He wasn't just trying to make sense of the world, he was actively working to change himself, to break down the walls he had built around his own heart. Isabel had helped him see that it wasn't enough to just recognize the injustice in the world, he had to fight against it. He had to be part of the solution, not just a passive observer. But as much as Ethan was growing, he couldn't ignore the tension that was still present in his life. His parents had not changed, and neither had his friends. They still made jokes about his newfound cause, still treated him like he was going through some phase, as though his shift in perspective was something temporary, something they could dismiss. But deep down, Ethan knew that he couldn't go back to the person he had been. He couldn't pretend that the world was the same anymore. The more he learned, the more he realized that he had a responsibility to use his privilege for something greater than himself. And then, one day, everything came to a head. It was a Saturday afternoon when Ethan's mother, Caroline, called him. Her voice was tight, controlled, as though she were carefully choosing each word. "Ethan, she began, "I need to talk to you. About Isabel." The tension in her voice was palpable. Ethan knew exactly where this was going. His mother had never been one to mince words when it came to her social circle, and she wasn't about to start now. "What about her?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "She's causing a stir in the community," Caroline said, her words clipped. "People are starting to talk. You can't be associated with someone like that, Ethan. It's bad for your reputation." Ethan's heart raced as he listened to his mother's words. He had known this moment was coming, but he wasn't prepared for the way it felt. "What do you mean, bad for my reputation?" he asked, his voice faltering. She's a person. She's not some project, Mom. She's someone who's been through hell and is still standing. And I don't think I should be ashamed of that." Caroline's silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "I'm not asking you to be ashamed of her," she said finally, her voice thick with frustration. "I'm asking you to think about your future. You can't let someone like her ruin everything we've worked for." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had always known that his mother cared more about appearances than anything else, but hearing her so blatantly dismiss Isabel's humanity, as if she were some stain on his life, made something inside him snap. "Maybe it's my future that I need to worry about," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Maybe I need to stop worrying about what people think and start worrying about doing the right thing. I'm not going to abandon Isabel. I won't be a part of a world that thinks people like her are disposable." Ethan hung up the phone, his breath shallow as the weight of his words sank in. This was it. There was no going back now. He had chosen his path, and there was no turning around. The truth was, he was no longer the same person who had sat down for that dinner with Isabel weeks ago. He had learned too much, seen too much. And now, he had to live with the consequences that would change not just his life, but the lives of those around him. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt free. Free from the expectations of his parents, free from the judgments of his friends, and free to live his life the way he knew it should be lived. With purpose. With integrity. And most importantly, with empathy. The days following his confrontation with his mother were an intense blur for Ethan. He had expected some resistance, but the weight of the decision he had made began to settle heavily on his shoulders. No one had truly warned him about the emotional cost of living authentically. The world he had known, the comfort of privilege, the ease of keeping his life tidy and uncomplicated, was slipping away, replaced by something far more challenging and unpredictable. Ethan often found himself standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down at a future that was both exhilarating and terrifying. But he could not deny that every step he took further from his old life, the more alive he felt. He was no longer just existing, floating through his days, he was living, every moment pulsing with significance, every choice carrying weight. And while the freedom he was beginning to experience was intoxicating, it was also isolating. The first true test came the following weekend, when Ethan's parents invited him to one of their frequent social gatherings, a lavish affair held in their sprawling estate. The invitation was extended with the usual expectation that Ethan would come alone, smile politely, and mingle with the guests, who were the crème de la crème of their social circle. These were the people who had shaped his worldview, people whose approval had always meant the most to his family. Ethan had been to dozens of such parties before, but this time, everything felt different. The familiar faces that once felt like a warm blanket now seemed suffocating. Their laughter, their casual conversations about the latest trends and luxurious vacations, only served as a reminder of the life he was starting to lead, something more meaningful in the process. Ethan looked at the invitation in his hand, the embossed gold lettering a stark contrast to the calloused reality of his heart. For years, this kind of gathering had been his entire world. And now, standing at the crossroads of his own transformation, he felt a deep, almost painful, tug between two worlds. His old life was comfortable, yes, but it was suffocating. The more he thought about the event Isabel had invited him to, the more he realized it wasn't just about her, it was about the possibility of being someone new. Someone who didn't measure his worth by the company he kept, but by the choices he made, the people he supported, and the way he chose to engage with the world. "I'm not going," he told his mother later that evening when she called to remind him of the event. His voice was firm, more resolute than he had expected. "I'm going to a different event instead." At first, his mother's response was shock. "Ethan, you're not seriously turning this down, are you? This is important. This is your future. You need to be seen with the right people if you want to succeed." Her words were cutting, but they were also revealing. They showed Ethan exactly what she valued: success, image, the appearance of having it all. But for Ethan, the more he thought about it, the more those things seemed irrelevant. The idea that success could be measured by how many people approved of him, or how many rich and influential figures he surrounded himself with, felt hollow. He had learned, through Isabel and his own growing self-awareness, that real success had nothing to do with appearances. It was about authenticity, about fighting for what mattered, and about standing up for the people who were often forgotten by society. Ethan hung up the phone and walked out of his house, a mixture of nerves and excitement swirling inside him. He felt like he was leaving behind an entire life that had once seemed so important, but now felt like an illusion. As he made his way to the park, he thought about Isabel's invitation, about how she had been a catalyst for this transformation in him. She wasn't just a person, she was a symbol of everything he had been blind to before. The world she lived in was messy and complicated, yes, but it was real. It was a world where people didn't have the luxury of pretending that everything was okay, where struggles were visible, and kindness was essential for survival. The park was a far cry from the gleaming halls of his parents' estate. It was a patch of grass in the middle of the city, surrounded by aging trees and worn-down benches. There were families, young children playing, elderly couples sitting and chatting, and a mix of individuals from all walks of life. There were no suits or designer labels here, no extravagant displays of wealth. Just people, living their lives. As Ethan walked into the event, the energy was palpable. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. There was music playing in the background, a group of volunteers handing out food and supplies, and a sense of camaraderie among the attendees. Isabel was there, standing at the center of it all, talking to people, laughing, and helping wherever she could. She looked different from the woman he had first met, a little more worn, perhaps, but also more vibrant, more alive. She was in her element here, surrounded by people who understood her, who had shared similar struggles. When she saw him, a wide smile spread across her face, and Ethan felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. She wasn't just happy to see him, she was proud. Proud that he had chosen to join her, proud that he was willing to be part of something that had no superficial appeal, something that couldn't be measured by status or wealth. "I didn't think you'd come," Isabel said, her voice warm with a hint of surprise. Ethan shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed but also strangely at peace. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "But then I realized, this is where I'm supposed to be." Isabel looked at him with a knowing smile, as if she had already anticipated this moment. She gestured around them, to the people gathered, to the sense of community that hung in the air like a thick, comforting blanket. "You made the right choice," she said softly. "This is where real change happens. Not in the halls of power or the rooms full of money, but here. With people who know what it means to struggle and still keep going." As the afternoon wore on, Ethan found himself engaging with people he never would have approached before. They were people he had once viewed as other, people whose lives seemed distant and disconnected from his own. But now, sitting with them, talking with them, hearing their stories, he began to see the world differently. He realized that every person had a story, every person had a journey that was worth understanding. The judgments he had once placed on people who lived differently from him began to dissolve, replaced by empathy and respect. He no longer saw the world in terms of categories, rich and poor, privileged and marginalized. He saw it in terms of human beings, all deserving of dignity, all worthy of compassion. The event ended as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the park. People said their goodbyes, exchanging hugs, smiles, and promises to meet again. As Ethan walked alongside Isabel, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He wasn't just grateful for the experience, he was grateful for the way it had shifted something fundamental inside him. This wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was about becoming the right person. He had chosen to step away from a world that defined success by wealth and image, and instead, he had chosen a path that measured success by impact, by relationships, and by the difference he could make in the lives of others. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the only one that felt true. And as they walked together into the evening, Ethan realized that he wasn't alone anymore. He had found his place in the world, not in the world he had left behind, but in the world he was beginning to build, one choice at a time. And though the road ahead would be uncertain, filled with obstacles and challenges, he knew one thing for sure: he was no longer afraid of what the future might hold. Because for the first time, he was living it on his own terms. The weeks following Ethan's decision were filled with a blend of exhilaration and confusion. The world he had once known seemed like a distant memory, and as much as he tried to maintain contact with his old friends, his old lifestyle, something inside him had shifted irreversibly. He could no longer simply pretend that everything was fine, that his life could be divided neatly into categories of privilege, wealth, and ease. The questions that had once seemed irrelevant, questions about fairness, justice, and social responsibility, now gnawed at him constantly. He found himself looking at the world differently, at the people around him differently, and even at himself differently. The values that had shaped him for so long were now being questioned by the very people he had once turned his back on, people like Isabel who, despite their challenges, lived with a sense of purpose and authenticity that Ethan couldn't help but admire. But change, as he quickly learned, is never a smooth, uninterrupted journey. The moment he had stepped away from his family's influence and embraced a life that was messy, complicated, and real, he had also stepped away from the security he had always known. The uncertainty crept in quietly at first, like a whisper in the back of his mind. He felt it when he walked into his apartment after a long day of volunteering at the shelter, looking at the bare walls and knowing that, for the first time in his life, he was on his own. His friends, the ones he had grown up with and had shared so many good times with, began to distance themselves. Invitations to parties and social events slowed to a trickle, and when they did come, they felt more like obligations than opportunities. Ethan could feel their judgment, their silent disapproval. It wasn't that they outright condemned him for his choices, but their actions spoke louder than words. They couldn't understand, why he would throw away a life of comfort and luxury for the uncertainty and struggle of the life he had now chosen. There were no designer clothes, no exclusive events to attend, no cushy jobs with guaranteed paychecks. There was no clear path forward, no safety net to fall back on if things went wrong. And that was something Ethan had to face every single day. The fear of failing, of falling back into the life he had left behind, was always lurking in the background, a reminder of how fragile his decision was. He found himself asking, at times, if he was doing the right thing, if he had made a mistake. But then there were the moments of clarity, the moments when he saw the impact of his choices on others. He saw it in the eyes of the people at the shelter who were grateful for the time he spent with them, for the kindness he offered. He felt it in the way Isabel looked at him, not with pity, but with respect, as if she saw in him the potential for something more. And he heard it in the words of the woman he had met at the community event, who told H. And he heard it in the words of the woman he had met at the community event, who told him that his presence, that simple act of showing up, had made a world of difference to her. It was in those moments, when the weight of his doubts felt unbearable, that Ethan found the strength to continue. These were the moments when he realized that the life he had chosen, while difficult and uncertain, was the only one that mattered. One afternoon, a breakthrough came when he decided to visit a local youth center, a place that had become a refuge for young people who were struggling to find their way in the world. It was an old building, worn down by years of use, but it had a certain charm to it, a sense of resilience that spoke to Ethan's heart. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but as soon as he stepped inside, he felt a sense of belonging that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The kids there were not like the polished, privileged young adults he had grown up with. They were raw, real, and unapologetically themselves. Their lives weren't perfect, but there was a sense of hope in their eyes, a hope that Ethan had long since lost sight of. He met one of the young women, a girl named Maria, who had just turned 18. She had been through more than most people would in a lifetime, from growing up in a rough neighborhood to losing her mother at a young age. Maria had a defiant energy about her, but there was also a tenderness to her, something that spoke to Ethan on a deeper level. As they spoke, she shared her dreams of becoming an artist, of creating something beautiful out of the pain she had experienced. She spoke about her struggles with finding her voice in a world that often overlooked people like her, and yet, through it all, she never lost her belief in the possibility of change. It was in that conversation that Ethan realized something profound. He had spent so much of his life trying to protect himself from the world's harshness, from its injustices and inequities. But the truth was, the only way to make a difference was to embrace those very challenges, to dive into the messiness of life instead of running away from it. Maria wasn't looking for someone to rescue her, she was looking for someone who understood her struggle and who was willing to stand beside her as she fought for her future. And in that moment, Ethan realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to fix everything. What mattered was showing up, being present, and being willing to listen. He returned to his apartment later that evening, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in months. The confusion, the doubt, and the fear still lingered, but they no longer defined him. He wasn't alone in this journey. There were others, like Maria, who were fighting their own battles, and together, they could make a difference. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the path he had chosen, and the one he had left behind. He thought about his parents and the life they had envisioned for him. He thought about the challenges ahead, the obstacles that would come, and the mistakes he would inevitably make along the way. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he was on the right path, the one that aligned with who he truly was. The next day, Ethan met Isabel for coffee at a small cafe they had grown fond of. She greeted him with her usual warmth, her eyes twinkling with the kind of quiet joy that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be. They talked about their plans for the future, the work they wanted to do, and the people they wanted to help. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt that familiar spark of excitement. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about creating something bigger, something that could leave a lasting impact on the world around him. As they sat together, discussing their hopes and dreams, Ethan realized that the journey he had embarked on was far from over. There would be setbacks, there would be doubts, and there would be moments when the weight of his decisions would feel unbearable. But he was no longer afraid. Because he knew, deep down, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. And in that knowledge, he found a sense of peace that he had never known before. The world had changed, and so had Ethan. He wasn't the same person who had walked away from his family's life of luxury and privilege. He had evolved into someone new, someone who saw the world with eyes wide open, someone who had learned that true success wasn't about what you had, but about what you gave. And with Isabel by his side, and the community he had come to love, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together, they could change the world.